Hello, and welcome to Cloaker's Education Foundation, where we provide quality content for amazing teachers and students. If you're joining us from our previous video on the legislative branch, welcome back. And if this is your first time, we're glad you're here. This is our U.S. government series, and this lesson is on the executive branch. Now, before we begin, don't forget to check out the links in the description below for resources on Teachers Pay Teachers and a set of free guided notes to go along with this lesson. Let's dive in. As we begin our lesson, I want you to take a moment and think, why is the presidency often referred to as a glorious burden? Take a few moments and answer that in your guided notes. Our goal is to look into that throughout the duration of our lesson, so let's get started. Now, who assists the president? When George Washington was president, people recognized that one person could not carry out all of the duties of the president without some assistance and advice. With a new and growing nation, it is difficult to run it all as one individual, and so the president receives help from the vice president, from cabinet members, and from heads of independent agencies and executive agencies. Unlike the powers of the president, their responsibilities are not defined in the Constitution. The executive branch is split up, so you have the president at the head, the chief executive. He has his cabinet members, the heads of the 15 executive departments. You have federal agencies, which are created by Congress, and you have the vice president, who is a member of his cabinet. Now, when we talk about this glorious burden, being the president of the United States is a very stressful job. And so we see this progression. Look at President Obama in 2007, so young, full of life. On his re-election night in 2011, you can see the stresses of the presidency have weighed on him. And in January 2016, at his final State of the Union, 8 years into his service, you can see the effects of the stress on President Obama. Now, he is not the only one. You see George Bush and the effects that war has on him with the attacks of 9/11. You see the stress and the effects of Bill Clinton from when he started versus when he left. You see Donald Trump when he announced he was running for president versus the end of his first term, even just 4 years. And you can see the effects on President Biden from 2021 to 2024. Now, to be the president, you have to have certain qualifications. First is you have to be a native-born citizen, a citizen at birth. This means you must be born to American parents or born on American soil. You have to be at least 35 years of age, and you have to be a resident for at least 14 years. Notice there are no terms about previous legal experience or military experience. 3 pretty simple requirements. Now, our president is elected to a term of office every 4 years. Originally, the presidency had no term limit. Okay, so a president could run as many times as he could win. However, we had the passage of the 22nd Amendment, and this set a 2-term limit. And the reason the 22nd Amendment was passed is because we had a president, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He won 4 elections. Now, he died at the end of his 3rd before he started his 4th term, technically. He was the president for 12 years, 12 consecutive years. And he was incredibly popular, winning elections in a landslide. And so Congress was afraid that we were going to become a monarchy-like state and that a president would be a tyrant And so they placed a limit of 2 terms after FDR. Now this has a statement that he cannot be elected for more than 2 terms, and so there are some caveats of how someone might continue to serve. Now, the presidency, there are some salaries and benefits. He makes $400,000 a year plus a $50,000 living allowance. They get the use of Air Force One and Marine One, that is the helicopter, if you did not know. The use of the White House for living and Camp David, which is a private presidential retreat. And so there are benefits, of course, to being president financially. However, there are many Americans who make well over $400,000 a year and make more than the president. Now, again, just to recap, we have quite a few qualifications of the president, 3 simple ones: native-born citizen, 35 years old, resident for 14. The terms of office, a 4-year term. There were originally no term limits, and then we set a 2-term limit. And then we discussed salaries and benefits. $400,000 a year plus a living allowance, the use of Air Force One, and of course the White House. Now let's talk about the second in command, the vice president. The vice president has, of course, the same qualifications as the president, and so they need to be 35 years of age, a resident for the last 14 years, and they have to be a native-born citizen, a citizen at birth. They have duties and responsibilities, many of which are assigned to them by the president, depending on the role they're going to play in that administration. They have to take over if the president dies or is removed from the office, and they have to preside over the Senate. The vice president does get paid substantially less than the president, an annual salary of $186,000 plus a $10,000 living allowance. As outlined, the VP, one of her most important jobs is being next in line for presidential succession. Not many Americans or people have realized exactly how many presidents have died while in office. And of course, we had President Nixon resign. And in each case of one of those deaths, the vice president took the oath and became president, as stated in the Constitution. 8 sitting U.S. presidents have died while in office. We are on President 47 in 2025. That means 17% of our government leaders, when they were elected, died while in office. So let's talk about them. The first sitting U.S. president to die in office was William Henry Harrison. He died of pneumonia just 31 days after taking office because he stood out in the rain to give his inauguration address. And in that case, John Tyler took over. Zachary Taylor was elected and died in 1850. He died of acute gastroenteritis caused because he ate contaminated food or contaminated water. It's unsure what exactly caused the death, but he died from eating contaminated food. And in that case, Mr. Millard Fillmore took over as president. Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford Theater. This was in 1865, and the VP, Andrew Johnson, took over. President Garfield died from infections and complications after being shot by an assassin, and Chester Arthur took over. That assassin would be Charles Guiteau, who shot him because he was not given a job as a judge like he thought he was entitled to. In 1901, President McKinley was killed by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz, and Vice President Theodore Roosevelt then took office, the youngest person to hold the office of the presidency. President Warren Harding died in 1923 of a heart attack while in a presidential tour in San Francisco, and VP Calvin Coolidge then took over for the Roaring Twenties. FDR died of a cerebral hemorrhage while he was sitting down for a presidential portrait in 1945 after leading the U.S. through World War II and having served 3 consecutive terms, winning his 4th election. He would have continued to serve if he had not died, and after his death, President Harry Truman took over and finalized the war with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan. And most recently in 1963, JFK, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated in Dallas, and sitting VP Lyndon B. Johnson took over. And not dying, but in the 70s, President Richard Nixon, after the scandal of Watergate, decided to resign, and we got the only man never elected, which was Gerald Ford. So Richard Nixon had won. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, stepped aside before he could be impeached for tax evasion, and Gerald Ford was appointed to the VP position and then would later serve as president after Richard Nixon resigned. Shortly after Kennedy's death in 1967, the states ratified the 25th Amendment, and this simply states that the new president can choose and nominate a new vice president, and that new vice president must be then approved by both houses, by the House of Representatives and the Senate. And this was simply installed to make sure that if the president passed away and the VP took over, someone would be there and they'd establish a line of succession when it comes to presidential order. When we talk about the order of presidential succession, it goes the vice president, speaker of the House, president pro tempore of the Senate. Now again, this is who runs the Senate when the VP can't be there. The member of the president's cabinet in order of which their departments were created. And so that would go the Secretary of State, Treasury, Defense, the Attorney General, or the Secretary of the Justice Department, the Secretary of Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security. And you can see when they were all established. So the State Department was established in 1789. Treasury, they were part of the original establishment. Then we expanded our nation, and we have the Department of the Interior, Agriculture, and you can see the years of which they were added. The Department of Defense in 1947 after World War II, all the way up to the Department of Homeland Security established in 2003. So again, just to reiterate the order of succession within the departments based off of the age: State, Treasury, Defense, the Justice Department, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and then Homeland Security. We've talked all about this, and I'm sure you're wondering, well, what does the president exactly do? Now, that's the next portion of this lesson, the 7 major roles of the president, being chief executive, chief diplomat, the commander-in-chief, political party leader, the legislative leader, the judicial leader, and the chief of state. So, as the chief executive, he is responsible for allowing our government bodies to carry out the nation's law, to issue executive orders, rules that the command of president can issue using the force of law, usually during a time of crisis. However, in more recent eras, they have been used quite freely. They appoint cabinet members, ambassadors, judges, and of course heads of government and those agencies. Again, their job is to help carry out the nation's laws, but this does not mean when the president passes a law, if they were to ban wireless speakers, the president himself is not, or herself is not going to go door to door. They are going to use their executive departments, law enforcement. As chief diplomat, they're responsible for making treaties with other countries, and then that goes to the Senate for approval. They meet with foreign leaders. They can make executive agreements with the leaders of other countries, and those have the force of law, but they don't require the Senate to then go approve. They appoint ambassadors, and the Senate again will get a say in who is the ambassador. But that ambassador will be the representative for our nation to a specific nation. So a ambassador to Germany. We have one person to nurture that relationship with that nation state. The president is the commander-in-chief. They are the final authority in all military matters. The founding fathers thought civilian control over the military was best, that a person elected by the people has say in all military matters. Now, the president can use the military in times of war. For example, in 1973, the War Powers Act passed by Congress because of the Vietnam War. The president had used the military without Congress ever approving it. And now the president must notify Congress when troops are sent anywhere, and troops must be brought home after 60 days unless Congress declares war or gives approval for the troops to stay longer. Now, this law has never been challenged in the Supreme Court, and so it could possibly be a checks and balance issue, but it has never been brought forth for that challenge. The president is the political party leader. They support party members in elections and campaigns. They unify the party and appoint members of that party to key government jobs, whether it's the Republican or the Democratic or the American or the Whig or the Federalist Party. They appoint members to support their party. They are the political party leader. His job and her job includes legislative leader, to propose legislation to the House and to Senate, and they use tactics to help push these bills along. They help prepare and finalize the federal budget, and then when Congress approves or votes on a law, the president gets to approve or veto that legislation. He is the judicial leader. Now, when we talk about checks and balances, the president gets to appoint judges to the federal courts and to the Supreme Court. And so very often we see that presidents will appoint judges to the Supreme Court that have similar views to their own. Now, when they want to appoint a judge, they nominate them, and then the Senate has a hearing where the Senate will then either approve or reject the candidate the president has picked out. And last but not least, the president has a very important job as the chief of state. They are symbolically representing every and all Americans. They give a human face to the American government, and this can be demonstrated in many ways, such as greeting war heroes. Very famously, they will go on opening day to a baseball game and throw out the first pitch. Barack Obama, being from Chicago, went and threw out a pitch for the White Sox. They'll invite musicians to the White House. They'll invite winning sports teams to the White House. So when LSU or Alabama or whoever plays for the national championship and wins, that winning team will be invited to the White House. They will attend funerals when another country's leaders die. So for example, in 2025, when Pope Francis passed away, Donald Trump and many other leaders of nations went to Rome and were there for the funeral of Pope Francis and then came back to lead their nation. Very often they give speeches or help with ceremonies. They give that human face to the American government. Now, these three branches do provide checks and balances to each other. We're going to talk about that now as we've covered the legislative branch, and we'll be covering the judicial branch soon. So the executive branch checks on the legislative branch. The president can veto laws. that Congress is proposing, or he can call Congress into a special session to vote and handle an issue. The president can check on the judicial branch by appointing judges to the federal court system and to the Supreme Court. And so the president has influence on both the legislative and the judicial branch. Now, this also means that the legislative and the judicial branch have authority and have a check on the power of the president. Let's talk about it. So here are the legislative checks over the executive branch and the president. The Senate has to approve the treaties and presidential appointments. So when they appoint someone to the Supreme Court, the legislative branch gets a say in the matter. The House of Representatives, they're the one who create the budget. The power of the purse and money, it comes from the House of Representatives, so they have a say in where the money is going. If the president vetoes legislation, Congress can overrule that veto, override that veto, if they get a 2/3 majority. And lastly, Congress can impeach and convict the president or the vice president or anyone within government. Now again, impeachment means that Congress is pressing formal criminal charges on an individual, and then they must be convicted. Many presidents have been impeached where formal criminal charges have been pressed on a president. We have not had a president convicted and removed from office. Bill Clinton was impeached. Andrew Johnson was impeached. Richard Nixon was in the process of being impeached, but then resigned. Donald Trump has been impeached. But no president has ever been convicted and fired from the presidency despite impeachments. And the judicial branch. The judicial branch has checks and powers over the president because the Supreme Court can rule legislation and they can rule executive actions unconstitutional. And so the Supreme Court can say, hey, you are not following the Constitution. This law does not fit. This law is null and void. It no longer exists. So it's quite a dynamic relationship. The executive branch has checks and powers over the legislation because they can veto law and convene special sessions. The legislative branch has checks and powers over the president because they have to approve his representatives, they approve the budget, and they can impeach him. The president has authority over the judicial branch because he nominates Supreme Court judges and federal judges, grants pardons and reprieves, but the judicial branch has power over the president. They can give pardon, they can give reprieves, they can also rule that executive actions are unconstitutional and illegal. So when it comes time for the president to influence laws and legislation, they have to take an active role. We saw it when Kennedy very famously had to encourage legislation to put the U.S. in the space race to put a man on the moon to beat the Soviet Union. We've seen it many times where the executive branch can help influence the passage of laws. They can propose legislation, give Congress ideas for new laws. Every year when they give the State of the Union address, and again they're telling Congress, here's the progress, here's what we've done, here's what we need to do. That can give ideas for new laws. They can call for Congress to pass new laws. And this is, of course, a very important way for the president to communicate his agenda to Congress and to the public. But when a law comes to the president's desk, the president can approve it or veto it. Unlike governors, the president does not have a line action veto where he can cross out something and say, I don't like this part, and this part. He must either approve the entire thing or reject the entire thing and send it back to the Senate and the House and say, I want you to make these edits. And then, of course, they will continue to discuss it and vote on it. And they can influence laws in other ways by appointing officials to help carry out that law or carry out the program. they can appeal directly to the people, and of course, their cabinet members, those heads of those departments, those independent agencies and commissions, they are going to be great assets for the president to carry out their task and their agenda for the nation. One of our last portions is on the executive departments within this branch. Now, a department, Congress has the power to establish and reorganize and to eliminate executive departments. Their job is, of course, to have a specific responsibility. Defense, agriculture, justice, treasury. They all have a specific task that they are in charge of in a specific area where they have authority. Now, the heads of each department make up the president's cabinet. Now, originally, we started out with four: Secretary of State, which was Thomas Jefferson; Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton; the Secretary of War, which was Henry Knox; and the Attorney General, or the Justice Department, Edmund Randolph. Okay. They all served and advised the president on the matters of the nation. Now, the cabinet is not mentioned in the Constitution, but every president has chosen people to help them and assist them in the job, to advise the president, to help on laws. Most of their titles are Secretary of, except for the Department of Justice, they are the Attorney General. And so, for example, you can see historically in 2025, Trump's cabinet consisted of J.D. Vance as the VPs, Marco Rubio was Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy as Health and Human Services. You can see all of their positions, but the only one that didn't need Senate confirmation was J.D. Vance, again, elected by the people. If you were assigned this video by your teacher in your government course, you can copy this chart down, you can pause it, and then fill in the names of the secretaries for each of the departments if your teacher is going to quiz you over that. If you're watching this live in class, teachers, you can pause the video and do some research, or you can skip this piece and continue on to the next if it's not assigned, but go ahead and take a moment to pause this video and complete that task. And our last portion of this lesson, independent agencies and regulatory commissions. Now, these are created by Congress. It's the source of administrative laws. Laws not necessarily created by Congress, but an agency Congress has given permission to create certain laws. Now, an example of this would be our Federal Reserve. They're separate from the departments because they perform specialized duties, and they're designed to help carry out federal laws. Another example of this would be the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. They are tasked with collecting taxes from all individuals and businesses within the United States. They are an independent agency created by Congress. They have their own jurisdictions, again, because they have a specific task. They are outside of any branch of government. They're an independent agency. Again, they assist the branches, but they are an independent one. We also have commissions like the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, regulating interstate and international communications, radio, television, satellite, cable, internet. Example, if you're watching a Eminem music video on TV and they bleep out some profanity, that's a policy of the FCC because it was played within a certain time frame or a certain part of the day. All of these rules, regulations, and agencies have created quite an extensive federal bureaucracy, and this political cartoon from 1993 summarizes it great. I don't like Clinton's ideas about cutting the ranks of us federal employees, so I'm going to write him a nasty letter, and I'll stuff it in the envelope, and I'll lick the stamp. And now if we could just hire the extra people to mail it. Again, the increasement of federal bureaucracy with the agencies and regulations. This extensive federal bureaucracy is formed by the departments and the agencies outside and inside of the executive branch. Roughly 3 million people work within the federal bureaucracy directly, and this of course causes quite heavy rules and regulations that create a metaphorical red tape that hold people back from doing their jobs and tasks effectively and efficiently. For example, if you wanted to buy a box of pens for the office, you might have to fill out a form that gets approved by 5 or 8 people before you can go and purchase a small pack of pens on the department's budget. That red tape holds them back from doing their jobs efficiently. And that wraps up our lesson. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. I know it was another long one covering the entirety of the executive branch and all of the departments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, especially if you found this video helpful. Check us out on Teachers Pay Teachers, YouTube, and Rumble, and of course the Cloaker Education Foundation website. Our next lesson on the judicial branch, right there on the screen, is just a click away. I'll see you there.